This week, Commons' own Ashley Chinati speaks with Kat Lantegine. Lantegine is a Toronto-based playwright who became an accidental advocate for blood safety in Canada. Younger Commons listeners may not remember this, but in the early 90s it emerged that the organizations responsible for getting donated blood into hospitals were using inadequate screening processes. The end result was that thousands of Canadians were inadvertently infected with HIV and hepatitis C. In 1993, the Crever Commission was established, and by 1997, the Canadian Red Cross was no longer in the business of acquiring donated blood. That role fell to the newly created Canadian Blood Services and HEMA Quebec. 20 years on, however, some provinces and even our federal government want to relax the regulations on who can trade in blood products and potentially pave the way for for-profit companies to buy plasma from Canadians and ship it out of country. This is Ashley's interview with one woman who, in her own words, got mad, got active, and got results.
We do not have any evidence at the present time in Canada that AIDS has been transmitted unequivocally by a blood product.
Starting tomorrow, every drop of blood collected by the Red Cross in Canada will be tested for AIDS. 5 Canadians so far have caught the disease through blood transfusions, and the Red Cross wants to make sure that no one else gets infected.
Some Canadians who have the AIDS virus are going to get some help from the federal government. Ottawa announced today it will be giving out a total of $150 million to people who got AIDS from blood transfusions or blood products in the early 1980s.
Good evening. The victims of Canada's tainted blood tragedy will have their day in court. Tonight, Ottawa and the provinces have announced a full-scale judicial inquiry into the country's blood supply in the early 1980s. Justice Horace Crever called it a national public health disaster, caused by a systematic failure and mistakes that victims paid for with their lives, with their futures, with their dreams. After a 5-year investigation, the RCMP has laid criminal charges, including charges against the Canadian Red Cross and several doctors who were highly placed in Canada's blood distribution system.
My name is Kat Lantegine. I'm the executive director of BloodWatch.org, and all my information's on the site there.
This is a long story because it's been a big part of your life for a long time, but can you give me the quick version of how you got into this issue?
Well, it was an accident. I'm an accidental advocate. I had written a play called Tainted that premiered in Toronto in 2013, and it was about the tainted blood crisis. And during that time, the private blood clinics had set up beside a homeless shelter on Spadina, so it was a hot button issue of why they were there. And I had this amazing opportunity to use this piece of art as a platform to discuss the issue and also to protest the issue at the same time. And I was in a very unique position because I had just completed a 3-year research project across the country interviewing tainted blood survivors, the doctors, the lawyers, hematologists, scientists, people involved in the tainted blood crisis and the Crever inquiry. And I was able to loop them all together again after they hadn't sort of spoken for about 10 or 15 years at that time. And we banded together and advocated for Queen's Park here in Ontario to implement a ban. And it was successful.
So the Crever inquiry was, of course, the result after the tainted blood scandal of the 80s and early 90s, where people from getting blood transfusions contracted hepatitis C, HIV, AIDS, and other blood-borne diseases. Why that issue? Like, what tapped you into that specific issue?
The issue about the tainted blood crisis was always a personal one for me. My uncle died of AIDS in 2001. He was gay. He didn't contract AIDS from tainted blood, but he was blamed for it because he was a gay man. And a very dear family friend of ours contracted HIV from her husband, who was a hemophiliac, my godmother's sister. And so it was part of our family story. And it had a huge impact on me as a teenager. And it was a story I had been trying to tell for a very long time. And I tried to make a film. I couldn't get a film made in Canada, so I found that play was the perfect platform for it. And that was my personal draw to it. Since then, of course, I have relationships all across the country now with tainted blood survivors and their family members. And as the executive director of BloodWatch.org, the organization I co-founded, it is exceptionally, incredibly important to me that those people have a representation out there in the country, because as patients or people who've lost family members or people who are surviving, still with HIV or hepatitis C, they're quite worn out. from the fight. And so they need somebody out there fighting their corner who refuses to back down. What happened was, after we had that law passed in Ontario banning these blood brokers, which is in contravention to the Creever inquiry, a blood broker is different than Canadian Blood Services because they're literally just a middleman collector. So what they do is they just source the material and then they broker it on the international market to pharmaceutical companies to sell it at a profit. And then those pharmaceutical companies can make plasma-based medications, and then they try to sell those plasma-based medications around the world. The huge difference is Canadian Blood Services, as a public blood operator, provides blood and plasma for us that we fund as taxpayers, and they also have oversight to the system. So one of the biggest problems with the blood brokers in our country is that they actually are a competitor, right, to our national blood collector, who's trying to ensure that we're getting blood and plasma for domestic use. And so they're extremely problematic, and they've created problems in Germany and Austria as well. So the biggest problem right now is the impact on the voluntary system. So that's another huge problem, is that we have proof from Europe, because it's only allowed in 4 countries in the world, right? It's new in Europe, that they discovered that when private plasma brokers came in, they created competition for the public blood operator,
course,
right?
yeah.
And when they folded, because they have to make money, right? So some of these storefronts don't work. And the German Red Cross, in one particular case, went in to take over the clinic. They could only get 1 out of 6 donors back through the door because everybody wanted their 25 euros. So you burn your voluntary donor base. Once you culture somebody to be paid, it's very difficult to get them back into the system. And that is massive because there's so many issues under this about what it means, what the integrity of the blood system means. It means taking care of our donors, you know what I mean? Making sure they're integrated into the whole national system, making sure they're integrated into our healthcare system, mobilizing donors, right? So a really complex issue on how you manage a blood system what they try to do is distill it to this argument of, well, is it okay or not okay to pay people? And that's a complete bullshit argument, because that is not what we're arguing about. I mean, that itself, of course, we argue against. There's a whole bunch of issues, and the infection rates are higher when you pay people. You know, they tend to lie. It's a private company. It's a corporation. We have no access to those donor records. You know, neither does Canadian Blood Services. But this really is an issue about the safety of the voluntary blood system and the security of supply and how you manage it. You give that up to corporations, you get trade agreements in place.
And so for a long time after the tainted blood scandal and the Creever inquiry in Canada, this issue was sort of dormant. There was a lot of regulation. If there was any controversy in the blood system, it was opening it up to people who'd been banned because of their sexuality or even potentially where they were born. And so then your play comes out in 2013, then all of a sudden, what happens?
So all of a sudden, it was a hugely controversial issue because people had forgotten why it was so important to have Canadian Blood Services. And what we recognized, that the decisions that were being made or for people that were supporting private plasma were to support a corporation and their profits. It actually wasn't being made to get patients more plasma or collect more. It was literally just a financial decision. It was hugely controversial. I mean, we raged on. It was brutal here. The former health minister, Deb Matthews, told the clinic to shut down. They wouldn't shut down. She had to send the police in to raid their clinics.
So this all started in Ontario.
It all started in Ontario.
And how soon after your play came out? So give me that timeline. Your play comes out.
So the play comes out. We are fighting the issue in the public. We had a huge amount of press here in Toronto with the play. We were on the morning news. We advocated with tainted blood survivors. And we were able to get the law passed at Queen's Park. The following year in 2014, we actually toured my play that fall all around the province to gain support for the province. And it was a unanimous vote. So every single MPP at Queen's Park voted to pass that law to ban these blood brokers and protect the blood system in Ontario. I was told by so many people that I would never get consensus at Queen's Park because everybody was fighting and it was very
and it was a minority
volatile.
government.
You know what I mean? It was like, and I just said, watch me. There's no way that any of those MPPs as Canadian citizens are going to turn their back on a fellow patient, on patients or on this massive part of our Canadian history where we buried 8,000 Canadians. That's how many people died because of tainted blood in this country. And we've spent literally billions of dollars in giving compensation to those infected. And that inquiry of Justice Creevers does not stale date. There is nothing in his inquiry that stale dates today. Not a thing.
So how did BloodWatch come of this as a formal organization? Like you said, you're an accidental activist. You wrote this play. All of a sudden you become the spokesperson for this issue, and then it becomes a formalized thing and part of your life.
Well, at the end of having that law passed, I was exhausted like I'd never been exhausted before. They say advocacy usually has a 2-year limit. And I gained 20 pounds. Also, I remember having the celebratory dinner when we had the law passed. And it was one of the saddest meals I've ever had. And it was so sad because the people there that were the tainted blood survivors, you're raising a glass to all of these people that you've lost, and you had the law passed, but they should have never had to fight for it. So it was a hard one because, of course, some of these women, at that dinner party, they buried their husbands. Men who were lawyers during that time, co-infected hemophiliacs who fought very hard throughout the Creever inquiry. So it was kind of a sad victory, if that makes any sense. And then we talked a little bit about forming BloodWatch, but we were all really burnt out. And we thought, clearly, something like that needs to exist. You need a watchdog and a whistleblower, right, on the blood system if anything happens, but we'll get to it when the time comes. That was in January of 2015. Then at the end of 2015, CBC breaks the story that those blood brokers went and set up in Saskatoon. It was the first decision Jane Philpott made as a federal health minister in Canada. So as soon as Justin Trudeau's government got in, the clinics got licensed. And the Saskatchewan government welcomed them in. All of those negotiations and discussions happened behind closed doors. Nobody was informed, and it was all in secret. And I remember seeing the story because it was just after Christmas, and I was in Kelowna sitting there having dinner with my husband and my mother-in-law, and I sat up in bed that night, and he looked at me and he just said, "You're going to have to do it. You're going to have to drop everything and get into the ring." And we made the decision together. So I worked for 6 months for free because we had to raise money eventually for BloodWatch. We formed BloodWatch and I got into the ring. The realization that politics is a breeding ground for cowards just washed over me like never before, because it's true. Rarely are there MLAs and MPs that will just consistently stand up for something that is right, something that is just. And that's really scary because when it comes to, the blood system, that was our history. That shouldn't be our history now because everybody should know better. So that was the impetus. And then we discovered that Minister Philpott, to everyone's dismay, totally backed the idea of private blood brokers in Canada, and that they were going to move forward with licensing this company in every province, that they could get them in. So it became this massive battle on a federal level, but also on a provincial level. And ever since, I haven't been able to leave the ring. It's been a knockdown street fight with Big Pharma at our heels, who try to bully you. I mean, they tried to bully us. They forwarded a libel and defamation threat letter that they had written to the Council of Canadians as an intimidation tactic. They sent it to everybody, including Canadian Blood Services and CBC journalists at the National Post. I went on the radio the next day and said I would burn it and burn anything they sent, because we get to challenge our government in Canada. We get to speak out, and the pharmaceutical industry doesn't get to tell us how we write our public policy.
I think a lot of people stay out of politics because they don't feel like there's a way in if you're not an established player. And here you are, in a span of 4 years, went from being a playwright talking about a topical issue to the head of an organization that's affecting change in this country. What advice would you have for someone who has an issue that they're passionate about and they want to start rattling cages and start getting the ears of politicians? Because I think a lot of people feel like it's not something that they can do.
Everybody can do it, for sure. I think that the best thing to do first is to reach out to an advocate that you admire. I mean, I've had so many mentors. They were natural mentors around me because I was surrounded by all these veteran blood advocates. So I was in a pretty great position to do that first and to make sure they understand that in our country, we do have a democratic process and that it is the job of our members of parliament and our MLAs provincially to be the member of the public that is putting their hand up in the room on our behalf. It is not their job to be shills for the pharmaceutical industry or any other, private industry. That is not their job. They might have to negotiate, with those industries, but their job is to represent us, full stop. That means us, not their party. And so I think because right now we're in hyper-partisan politics, especially on the federal level, they need to push those values. So I would say that if you have an issue and you believe in it and you know it's right and you have integrity and ethics that you refuse to abandon, you will be able to win. But it's a long game. So the game is one of consistent effort. And they will try to exhaust you, right? They will try to exhaust you because everybody's fighting for an issue. And that is the thing that you just have to keep on it and never give up.
Great. Thank you. That was phenomenal.